All right, today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and, honestly, unusual ceremonies you'll find in ancient history. It's a ritual all about cleansing an entire community from, well, from the deepest contamination imaginable, death itself.
So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in ancient Israel for a second. In that world, death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was this source of ritual contamination that could literally spread. So the big question is, how on earth does an entire community purify itself from something so powerful and fundamental?
Okay, so before we can even talk about the solution, we've got to wrap our heads around the problem. In this ancient way of thinking, just coming into contact with a dead body created what's called ritual impurity. And let's be clear, this has nothing to do with being physically dirty. Nope, this was a spiritual state, a kind of unfitness that cut you off from the sacred. And believe me, it had some serious consequences.
And we're not talking about some minor social slip-up here. The law was absolutely crystal clear. If you failed to get purified, you would be cut off from Israel. That's not just a timeout. That's exile, a total separation from your family, your community, your entire world. The stakes just couldn't be higher.
You know, the crazy part is how easy it was to become unclean. It wasn't just about physically touching a corpse. Oh no, just walking into a tent where someone had died, you're unclean. Touching a human bone out in a field, or even a grave. Yep, that'll do it too. And get this, the contamination could even jump to objects. An open container in a tent with a dead body, that jar and everything inside it became unclean. It really acted like a kind of spiritual virus.
So when you have a problem this widespread, this pervasive, you're going to need a solution that's just as powerful. And the answer they had was, well, it was one of the most unique and specific rituals you'll ever come across, the ceremony of the red heifer. The whole cure revolved around this special substance called the water of cleansing, and its main ingredient, it came from the ashes of a very, very specific animal, a perfect red heifer. So this wasn't just any old water. It was this sacred mixture specifically designed to fight back against the contamination of death and bring a person back into a state of purity.
But here's the thing. You couldn't just, whip up a batch of these ashes. Making this powerful stuff was an incredibly precise, super sacred four-step process. And every single detail mattered. You couldn't skip a beat.
So first things first, step one was selection. You had to find a perfect red heifer, and perfect meant completely red, no blemishes, and, this is key, it had never been put to work, never worn a yoke. Then for step two, it was taken outside the camp to be slaughtered. Its blood was then sprinkled 7 times in the direction of the tent of meeting. Step 3 was the big one, fire. The entire heifer was burned, and they threw in some symbolic items too, cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool. And finally, step 4, a man who was himself ceremonially clean had the job of carefully gathering up all those ashes and storing them in a clean place. This was the precious stockpile.
Okay, so we've got the holy ashes made and stored away safely. Now what, right? How did they actually use them to purify someone who'd been contaminated by death?
Well, getting back to a state of purity wasn't a quick fix. It was this very careful, week-long process. It all started by taking just a pinch of those ashes and mixing them into a jar with fresh water. Then, on the 3rd day after someone became unclean, a clean person would take that water and sprinkle it on them. They'd do the exact same thing again on the 7th day. And the grand finale? On the evening of that 7th day, the person would wash their clothes, take a bath, and boom, they were finally considered clean again.
But this is where the whole thing gets really fascinating. Almost a little mind-bending, actually. Because right at the center of this whole purification law, there is a giant paradox.
So here it is, the big twist. The ritual absolutely makes the unclean person clean, right? But, and this is wild, every single person who helped make it happen became unclean in the process. Think about it. The priest overseeing the slaughter, the guy who burned the heifer, the man who gathered the ashes, even the person sprinkling the water, they all became temporarily unclean just by doing their sacred job.
Even the water itself held this strange double nature. On one hand, it's powerful enough to cleanse the most profound impurity there is, contact with death. But on the other hand, it actually passes on a lesser impurity to any clean person who touches it. So it's a source of cleansing and a source of contamination, all at the same time. How weird is that?
And you have to understand, this incredibly complex, paradoxical system wasn't just some casual suggestion. The text calls it a lasting ordinance. I mean, that's serious language. This was meant to be a foundational, permanent law, not just for the Israelites, but for any foreigners living with them too.
So when you step back and look at it all, a ritual this detailed, this specific, and this full of paradoxes really pushes us to ask a much deeper question. What does something like this really tell us about how a society wrestled with the huge, profound boundaries between life, death, and the sacred itself?